Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I want to talk about the Thoth court cards. Specifically, I want to have a little bit more of a conceptual and theoretical chat about the Thoth court cards. So this is less about teaching the meanings and familiarizing myself or others with the meanings, the book meanings or experiential meanings of the cards, and more so trying to have a dialogue around what the court cards in the Thoth mean in terms of the tarot structure, what they symbolize, and their depth and nuance, and also what separates them, in my opinion, from Rider-Waite-Smith and Marseille court cards. I particularly love the court cards in the Thoth, not just for their illustrative qualities, but also for their attributions in the way that they're spoken about and conceptualized by Crowley. So I have the Book of Thoth, which I'm going to be referencing a bit, and I have all the court cards laid out before me in a sort of structure. So I have all of the Wands court cards, and I guess we'll start there. I'm not going to go through each one specifically, but I guess I'll start with the structuring of the court cards for those who aren't familiar, and if you are, a primer or a refresher is always nice. So the court cards are thought of in, well, first I'll take it by suit, I guess. So as far as Crowley goes, and in a more Kabbalistic sense of the tarot, the wands come first, the element of fire, then water with the cups, air, and then earth, and this has to do with the sort of synthesis of these elements and what they symbolize in a more spiritualized sense, and how fire is more equated with spirit and this impetus of creation. Therein, water is created as its opposite and canceling aspect. So we have the yang and the yin, the masculine and the feminine, which then create the third, almost like a son of sorts in the air, and a daughter who is the earth. And then the son and the daughter are to almost take the place of the mother and father, and it's a sort of cyclical nature. They're also attributed to aspects on the Tree of Life and the Sephira. So we have the second emanation, the second Sephira of Chokmah, which goes to fire, and also the knights, who in Rider-Waite-Smith would be the kings. And then we have Binah, which is the third Sephira, the feminine or yin to the yang of Chokmah, and that's where we get the queens. And then we actually skip all the way down to the sixth Sephira, which is Tifereth, and it's more like a sun, the sun in a planetary sense, and also the sun in a court card, and that's where we see the prince. So this would actually be the knight in a Rider-Waite-Smith, or its equivalent, and I don't think there are exact equivalents, which I'll get into in just a moment, but I don't necessarily see this as being the Knight of Wands in the Rider-Waite-Smith, so take that with a grain of salt. And then we move all the way down to the bottom of the tree with Malkuth, the 10th sphere, this 10th Sephira, which is symbolic of, in a planetary sense, Earth, and that's where we would see the princesses, or what would be the pages in the Rider-Waite-Smith. And again, I don't think that these are exact equivalents. I read these actually quite differently, and the titles to me are symbolic of something much different from a Rider-Waite-Smith title in a court card. So a king to me, and while a knight would be an equivalent, I don't think that they are interchangeable. So equivalency is there, but interchangeability I don't find to be the case. And so that's very interesting. And then Crowley likes to make the distinction or speak to the courts in terms of elements and zodiacal astrological attributions, and to me that adds a layer of nuance. I find in the Rider-Waite-Smith or in the Marseille that the courts are really given personalities and are seen as personality types and people and composites or archetypes of a very specific type of human or personality, whereas in the Thoth, while we do get that, there is an emphasis on the attributions to elements, or at least combinations of elements, and the astrological correspondences as well, which I think makes it easier to see the cards as circumstances, as energies, as opposed to solely personality types. And I think that that's something many of us experience in the beginning of our tarot studies, we wonder how we might attribute a personality type to an experience. Is it speaking to us or the querent? Is it speaking to somebody else in a circumstance? So when we get a lot of court cards, it can be confusing because we are wondering, is this an experience? Is this an event? Is this an energy of a sort, or is it an actual person and a personality type? You wonder if all of the court cards might be speaking to you or somebody else or others, or none of the above. And so that can be really confusing. And I think that the way Crowley has conceptualized the court cards and the way that Lady Frida Harris has depicted them is nuanced and done in such a way that we are meant to understand the court cards as more than personality types, which I think is really valuable. So the first and one of the biggest attributions that Crowley puts to his court cards is the elements, or the mixture of elements. And so we then essentially get these formulas or mixtures of elements throughout the entire series of courts. So we see fire of fire going down from like fire of water, fire of air, fire of earth, all the way getting through the elements down to the earth of earth. So we have 16 combinations of elements wherein we get every element combined with each other. And in that same fashion, then we get each court card, which is a combination of the two elements. So we would get, for example, we would get the Knight of Wands, which is the fire of fire, the Queen of Wands, which is the water of fire, so on and so forth. And where we would see these combinations interacting is where we would get a sort of energetic composite or feeling of what the court card embodies and how that element might manifest, or what it might look like in a more practical sense or in a circumstance, as opposed to just a personality type. But of course, we can take these elements and see various mixtures within ourselves and others and then apply them in that way as well. But I think it's interesting that we have a more broken down, what feels like formulaic approach to the elements. A big and really interesting example I found of a comparative aspect of this in the Book of Thoth and throughout the tarot cards was actually in the Chariot card. And I guess this just goes to show how interesting the Book of Thoth is as almost a form of comparative literature. I view the actual Thoth deck as literature, as a sacred text, and it's spoken about, many speak about the tarot, including Crowley, in terms of it being this universal sacred text that is capable of illuminating all that is within the known and unknown universe, and speaking to anyone, anything, any aspect, any event that is known and unknown. And so we see the Chariot, and when Crowley writes about the Chariot, there was one aspect that I found very interesting. So of course we see the four sphinxes at the base pulling the Chariot, but we hear in the book that, where is it? This chariot is drawn by four sphinxes composed of the four cherubs, the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the man. In each sphinx, these elements are counterchanged, thus the whole represents the 16 sub-elements. And so I think it's easy for us to start to see all of the tarot cards as not maybe equal in their power, in their emphasis, in their weight, but of course we are taught, or at least many schools and forms of literature will state that the major arcana sort of hold a higher weight to them, or that of course the courts seem to have a little bit more weight than the minors. But I think that also sort of starts to get blended to us as readers through our practice. It's easy for us to look at this alongside a court card and not see either as having more weight or power or emphasis. And that's not to say that not all of the cards are equal. I think they're equal in capability and scope, but perspective's important. And so, for example, the Chariot's being pulled by essentially all of the 16 sub-elements. Those formulaic composites of the elements are at his will. He has power over them. He's mastered. It's almost a form of self-mastery in a sense. He has all of the elemental and, in a way, the personality types. Every aspect, every facet of himself is in alignment with where he'd like to go, and thus he can move forward. And it's when he has mastery over all of those aspects, all of those personality types and elements, that he's able to go forward in a divine way that's more unstoppable, that is profound and meaningful as opposed to aimlessly. And so in a way, for perspective, it's almost like he has all of the court cards pulling him. And of course that's very symbolic, and others might not find that to be the case. And that's not to say that one court card can't have more weight in a reading than the Chariot, but just for perspective's sake, I think having perspective within the cards and understanding that there is interconnected aspects between all of them is really important. And so the court cards actually, I find, feature very heavily within the Chariot. And then of course, if there is a court card within a reading in terms of the Chariot, I might look to the two in terms of connection, and then the direction might have to do with the sub-element that is, I guess, at the forefront. Another great example of perspective within the courts actually is one that isn't in the Book of Thoth, but I actually saw on Anna at Anna Astral Lady Tarot's channel. She did a video, or she's done at least 2 videos path working with the court cards, and in one she path worked with the Queen of Cups. I'll link her channel and this specific video down below, but she put herself into this sort of scene and wanted to acquaint herself with the Queen of Cups. And I found it very interesting that when she put herself in the scene, she saw the Queen of Cups as almost like a giant, as though she were very small and the Queen of Cups were quite large, many, many feet taller than a human being. And something great about the Thoth court cards, I find, is that in a way they are not human beings. It's very easy to look at a Rider-Waite-Smith court card and see it as human, as a very literal human, whereas with the Thoth courts, we are able to look at them in terms of energy and being. None of these really look quite like human beings that you or I would ever see in real life. Some of them are blue, some are green, some are yellow. Some are in armor. The proportions of the body are different. They're in fantastical images. Of course, we have the Knight of Swords here with wings, and he's yellow on a golden horse flying through the air. That's not quite human. And so for us to look at this, I think it's a lot easier to acquaint ourselves in a more detached sense with the idea of a court card as a being, as an energetic composite, as opposed to a very literal depiction of a human being. And I think when we look at the tarot in such literal and practical ways, there is a limiting aspect to that. Of course, it's nice for us to be able to see the world around us depicted through images, and that might help us to navigate very practical scenarios, but I think that inhibits and puts a cap on our thinking in terms of the capabilities of what these cards might speak to. I think it's a little bit limiting in terms of self-growth, and in a more, I guess, existential philosophical way, we are harder, it's harder to really find higher, deeper, more profound meaning in something that looks very much like a human being or a very literal scene, whereas with the Thoth, we get fantastical images and colors and all of that. And in that way, we're able to think greater, think beyond, to exercise our imagination. And I think imagination is crucial in interpreting and using the tarot for self-development, for spiritual progression, and to glean insight from. So in that way, I think that's really important as well with the court cards. And then next we get that astrological or zodiacal attribution that all of the courts have. And so we see that the knights, the queens, and the princes are all given a deacon or a set of 3 deacons throughout the wheel of the year. So they are all going to be given the last 2 deacons of a sign and the first deacon of the next sign. So there is a level of nuance in that each court card is not necessarily going to preside over a very specific sign. There's a layer of complexity, I think, that is added when they get the last 2 deacons of a sign that feels very appropriate to their element, and then they get the first deacon of a sign that comes after, which is usually a little bit of what seems to me to be like a wild card in a way. It's what makes them them. It adds this little twist on what you might imagine them to be and allows for more depth, more the unexplainable, I think, in a way. And so that part is really interesting. And I also find that it's interesting that the princesses are not given an astrological attribution. It makes sense because, of course, there would be 12 court cards for the 12 signs, but then again, they're being given 3 deacons and not necessarily a whole sign. And so you would think maybe we could break it down further and try to factor in the princesses, but that's not Crowley's intention, and that's not how he sees it to be. We actually get the princesses, which are more geographical, or maybe geographical is not the right way to put it, but they're the throne of the suit. And so in a way, they are set, in a way, for example, the Princess of Discs would represent in some ways all of the earth signs, but in other ways, she's very representative of the element of earth and less so the astrological, nuanced personality or detail-oriented aspects that come with a zodiac sign. And so in that way, the courts are different. She's almost like an outlier, and actually the princesses are spoken of as being a bit separate and the outlier in terms of a suit, whereas the knight, the queen, and the prince are actually spoken about very fluidly and easily and in context with one another, as though they all flow very naturally and easily. And it's almost like the princesses are made out to be the black sheep of the family, in that they are separate and low on the tree of life, but that in their difference there is a power. There's this sort of element that they hold that the rest of the family, so to speak, doesn't. And so they're necessary and capable of something that these 3 are not. And so there is a very big distinction for Crowley, it seems, at least in my readings. Sorry, the AC's kicking on. But there does seem to be a big difference between the first 3 court cards and then what would be the last, the princess, in terms, and they're not necessarily ranked either. While they are spoken about in metaphors and analogies that equate them to a family dynamic or to elemental dynamics that begin in a sort of emanation aspect going down the tree of life. And in the tree of life we see that the higher you are, the more perfect you are, the more pure you are, and the lower you go, the more degraded and less perfect and divine you are. While they are spoken about in that way, it is very much clear that there isn't as much a ranking within the court systems. And I think in the Rider-Waite-Smith, there is very much a clear system of rank. There's a hierarchy within the courts, whereas with the Thoth courts, it feels very much like they're all equal in their power, in their weight, in their capability. And so if one were to show up in a reading, that I wouldn't necessarily think that the princess is any weaker or of less importance than the queen. In fact, she holds a role that is very unique in and of herself, and one day she will become the queen in a sense, in an energetic sense. And so there isn't as much a hierarchy, but there is very interesting attributions in an astrological sense, in that I think it's very nuanced and important that they are each given the last 2 deacons of a sign and the first deacon of the sign following, and so that adds complexity. And then there's also less of a hierarchy, and while they are thought of in a more elemental and what would be the word for this? An emanation sort of sense, where they descend upon the tree, down through the tree of life, there isn't necessarily any rank. Nobody is of greater power or rule than another. And so that part I also find to be extremely interesting. And as far as the interchangeability that I spoke of in terms of the Rider-Waite-Smith or Marseille, there is an equivalency, but not necessarily an interchangeability. So with the courts, we would then think, okay, the equivalent to the Knight of Cups is the King of Cups. And while that might be the equivalent, I don't necessarily read the Knight of Cups in the same way that I would read the King of Cups in a Rider-Waite-Smith card. The reason for this is mostly that the way that these cards are spoken about, as far as the title goes, whether it be Knight, Queen, Prince, or Princess, is given specific qualities that seem to be different from that of a king, a queen, a knight, and a page. And I'll speak to these very briefly in terms of what Crowley has said in his general remarks on them. The knights represent the powers of the letter Yod In the name, they are the most sublime, original, active part of the energy of the element. For this reason, they are represented on horseback and clad in complete armor. Their action is swift and violent, but transient. And so that actually feels much more like a knight in the Rider-Waite-Smith, and while I just mixed these up. And while the knight would be the equivalent to the king, he is on this sort, in a hierarchy, he would be the mate to the queen, he would be the one who sits in the chakma spot of the Tree of Life. His qualities are actually quite like what we would see in a knight in the Rider-Waite-Smith, and so actually the title knight is kind of fitting, but in the same way he is of a higher spot on the Tree of Life, and his elemental attribution matches much more closely, I find, with what a king would be, but his actual actions and his role is somewhat similar in scope to that of a knight in the Rider-Waite-Smith. And so it seems almost like this hybrid of qualities between a knight and a king. Similarly, we get that hybrid of qualities in the prince, but in a different combination. And so that to me is very interesting, and I just read the courts completely different for that reason. And so while there are equivalents, they're not necessarily interchangeable with one another, I find. Likewise, we get, I'll skip down to the prince. The prince represents the force of the letter Va. In the name, the prince is the son of the queen. Okay, he is the active issue of their union and its manifestation. He is the intellectual image of their union. His action is consequently more enduring than that of his forebearers. So while we would normally think of a Rider-Waite-Smith knight to be quick and forceful and violent and transient and ephemeral, it seems as though the prince actually holds more, the prince, which would be the equivalent to a Rider-Waite-Smith knight, is actually more enduring in his actions, in his thoughts, in his effect on whatever it is that he's encountering. And so that's very interesting. In one respect, indeed, he acquires a relative permanence because he is the published record of what has been done in secret. And so it's very much seen as a learning process through the courts. So for example, we have the king, and he's powerful and forceful, but he comes first, and so he has nobody before him to look up to learn from. We then have the queen, who is the first receptive quality, and because she comes right after such an active force, she learns to be receptive, to fill the role of what is needed. And so when we have something that is so active and forceful, we need something that is passive and receptive to balance it. And then when they create together a third, we have the prince, and the prince now has two parents to look up to and learn from. And so he sees the active aspect and element of his father, he sees the receptive and passive elements within his mother, and he's somewhat of a mix of the two. And so this it's almost temperance in a way. It mirrors the qualities of the temperance or the art card, in that we see the fire of the father, we see the water of the mother, and when combined they temper each other. We see the air, the smoke that's given off by the union, and we get the prince. And the prince now has the best of both worlds. He has the best qualities of his father and the best qualities of his mother, and in that way he can be more enduring, more thoughtful, more measured in a way. The same with, for example, the princess. And while she is almost like I said before, the black sheep, the member of the family who's been castigated a little bit and cast aside, she has a knowledge of more practical materialization in a way, which the rest of her family doesn't. So she's able to take these conceptualized elements, these energies, and make them into something that can be seen, felt, that is tangible, and that will remain. And so while the prince is enduring in theory and concept, she's enduring in a practical element, in a literal element. We see the Princess of Cups, and it's actually I just shook the table. It's spoken about in a way that these crystals right here are the crystallizations of emotion, that she is able to take emotion and turn it into something physical and literal, whereas, for example, the rest of her family cannot. And so I find that to be very interesting as well in the way that the cards are spoken about. It's just very interesting, and we see that there's a lot of complexity and nuance. Part of this, of course, is an unfair comparison. I am biased in that I really favor the Thoth deck, And part of why I favor it is the artwork. I love Lady Frida Harris's artwork. I love abstract and non-literal depictions that aren't so practical. I also love the fact that there is the Book of Thoth and the way that Crowley has written about it. I love his concepts and ideas and the way that he has gone about creating the system, the specific system of the Thoth. And then there's also, I think, an unfair advantage in that there is a very specific guidebook to accompany the Thoth deck, and while there are books that speak to the Rider-Waite-Smith, arguably there are a lot more books that speak to the Rider-Waite-Smith. I don't think that's even arguable. There's much more literature out on that references the Rider-Waite-Smith. We don't really have a book. I mean, we kind of do. We have writings from Waite, but we don't have this one big, almost like a Bible for the Rider-Waite-Smith to reference, where Waite elucidates and illuminates the mysteries within his deck. And so in that way, it's unfortunate. I think if Waite had published one sole text to be seen as an authority in a way on his deck that let us in on what he was thinking, on the concepts and the nuances and the correspondences, that it would rival the Thoth in terms of, I guess, the complexity that I see in the Thoth. I'm not saying that there isn't complexity or nuance or correspondence or attributions within the Rider-Waite-Smith, but that we don't have writings from Waite that fill us in enough to the point where we would be able to speak on those sorts of things or to know them for sure, whereas we do get that with Thoth. And he was quite vocal, and there is a lot of extensive research and comparative literature where the Thoth is concerned, whereas the Rider-Waite-Smith is a lot more pictorial and literal and intuitive. At least I think that's what the general audience has taken the deck to be. And so a lot of the writings are more intuitive, and we see a lot of interpretation and creative liberties taken in books written on the Rider-Waite-Smith, whereas texts and literature surrounding Thoth is much more heavily researched, and we have a lot of references and technical jargon surrounding it. And so I guess I just wanted to preface or clarify in that way. I hope that this wasn't just a ramble. It was actually kind of a ramble, but it was one that I felt compelled to make, and a dialogue that I guess I wanted to have. And so I'd be really curious to know any of your thoughts on Rider-Waite-Smith quartz, Marseille quartz, which I know a lot less about, and Thoth quartz, as well as if you have other systems that you're interested in and those quartz cards. I'd love to know your thoughts, your findings, whether they be experiential or through books, if you have any recommendations on literature, what your favorite is, if you prefer the Rider-Waite-Smith quartz for one reason or another, or the Marseille quartz. I would love to know why and which one you prefer. So yeah, I just want to start a little bit of a dialogue. Let me know. And if you want to make a response video speaking to the Thoth quartz in your own way and how you see them to be, if you want to make one on the Rider-Waite-Smith quartz, I would love to hear from you. So I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was something that you enjoyed. And until next time, bye.